Hey everyone, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Promeia, an anomaly DPS that relies on stringing together basic and special combos to trigger ablooms that deal massive damage. I'll be discussing her kit, builds, wenjins, and possible themes. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information that will be shown is from the creator experience server, so things can still change when her banner drops. Now before we begin, I would just like to give a big spoiler warning since this video will contain a lot of footage featuring the new Deadly Assault boss that appears in the upcoming story. Let's start by discussing her unique resource, Corrosive Chill, which is indicated under her health bar and has a max of 100 points, with you generating points just by hitting enemies with most of Promeia's abilities. And you also get a set 5 points whenever any party member triggers freeze, 5 when a disorder is triggered, and 10 when using her EX special Execution Shrouded in Shadow. It's also worth to mention that she gains 15 Corrosive Chill when any party member triggers an abloom, and 5 Corrosive Chill when Vortex is triggered on an enemy, which is the new anomaly for the new Wind element that is only currently available on the new Deadly Assault boss. But with that being said, once you gain 50 Corrosive Chill, it automatically gets consumed to give you 1 Trial by Cold. Promeia starts combat with 2 stacks of Trial by Cold, and she can hold a max of 2 stacks at a time. And if she already has 2 points, Corrosive Chill will continue to build to 100 points without getting consumed, so you don't have to worry about wasting points. Now 1 point of Trial by Cold is needed to be consumed in order to use her EX special Merciless Judgment, and this is the main way you'll be proccing her ablooms. Just note, you can only use this EX special by holding basic after her BA5 and special attacks Layered Frost and Descending Frost, and it's one of her few abilities that can't build Corrosive Chill. Now, it's worth to mention that her ablooms are actually a bit unique compared to the ablooms from other agents, since it does not have unique multipliers for each element, but instead has different multipliers depending on which of Promeia's abilities triggered it. For example, regardless of element, the abloom from her EX special will always deal 635% of the original anomaly damage dealt, while her chain attack only deals 100%. Now we can move on to her basics, which is her fairly standard basic attack combo string. However, like I mentioned earlier, you can combo directly into her EX special Merciless Judgment from her BA5 to trigger ablooms just by holding the basic button. It's worth noting that her basics actually generate energy pretty fast even without an energy slot 6, which is especially the case the more field time you give her. On that note, she also has a unique charge attack which has her throw her cape. However, this attack can't build Corrosive Chill, but it does put her into the bound absolution state. Now while in this state, Promeia's cape stays in place to continually attack enemies, and when moving, Promeia starts to aura farm. But just note, this attack can't build Ice Anomaly, and if you're hit while she's aura farming, she automatically dodges, but this auto dodge can only trigger every 20 seconds. But more importantly, from this state, you can combo directly into her BA5, then into her EX special Merciless Judgment. So essentially, the main purpose of this state is to help combo into her ablooms faster, since several of her abilities also put her into the bound absolution state. Cause with that being said, her second EX special, Glacial Death, also puts her into the bound absolution state, and after using it, it gives her the Absolute Order buff, which lets her trigger her special attacks Descending Frost and Layered Frost. Now let's first look at Descending Frost, which has 2 activation methods. The first is by immediately pressing basic or the special button after using her EX special, Glacial Death, while the second is by pressing the special or basic button while in the bound absolution state. And again, this attack directly combos into her EX special Merciless Judgment to trigger her ablooms. Now before we can talk about her special attack Layered Frost, we first have to look at her EX special Shrouded in Shadow, which also has 2 activation methods. The first is by pressing the EX special button after a perfect dodge with at least 40 energy, and if you do it this way, it also gives the Absolute Order effect. While the second is it automatically gets activated if you get hit shortly after activating her EX special Glacial Death. It's also worth noting that this EX special does generate 10 points of Corrosive Chill, so try to activate it as often as you can to maximize her resource building. But after triggering it, it lets you combo directly into her special attack Layered Frost by pressing the basic or special button, which again combos into her EX special Merciless Judgment to trigger her ablooms. On that note, we can move on to her chain attack, which like I said triggers an abloom if the enemy is under an anomaly. This particular abloom has a damage multiplier of 100%, but it's essentially just free damage, so make sure to have Promeia do double chain attack combos. Her ult on the other hand is essentially just an upgraded version of her chain attack with a higher abloom multiplier of 250%. But thanks to her core passive, Promeia can actually use it more often compared to the average agent, with it giving her 100 decibels after every abloom Promeia triggers with a cooldown of half a second. Her core passive also grants her the Frost Oath buff after using her ult. This buff lets you combo into her special attack Layered Frost after her ult and EX special Merciless Judgment. And finally, for every point of initial anomaly mastery she has above 150, she gains 1.5 AP and the team's abloom damage increases by 0.35%. But just note, this needs out-of-battle anomaly mastery, so in-battle buffs like Alice's signature do not help with it. Now for her additional ability, it needs an anomaly or support character to activate, and it increases her anomaly build-up rate by 30% for 30 seconds after using any of her EX specials, and this does have a refreshable duration. It also extends the duration of Frostbite applied by any teammate by 3 seconds, while enabling her EX special to apply the Presumption of Guilt debuff. This debuff allows any abloom damage from the team to ignore 40% of the enemy's defense for 30 seconds with a refreshable duration, which when combined with her abloom buff is pretty insane when you plan to run her with other abloom units. Now finally for ability prio, level up her core skill first, then her EX special, basics and ult, then dodge, and finally her assists. Now you can get away with only leveling up her core skill since that's the only thing that affects her abloom damage, cause her chain level does not affect the multipliers from the ablooms triggered with her ult and chain attack. But if you wanna min-max her damage, you can still level up her abilities. But with her kit out of the way, let's talk about her Mindscapes. Her M1 enables her ult to give her a point of trial by cold if she's not yet at max points, while also increasing her passive's abloom def ignore by 20% for a total of a 60% def ignore. Overall, it's a pretty simple Mindscape that allows you to trigger more ablooms if played correctly, while enabling more damage through more defense reduction. As for her M2, it gives a permanent 40 AP buff, while increasing the damage multipliers of the ablooms triggered from consuming Trial by Cold with her EX special by 120%. So it goes from 635% all the way to 755% of the damage dealt by the original anomaly. Again, it's a pretty simple Mindscape for increasing her damage. While her M4 enables her ablooms to restore 5 corrosive chill whenever they're procced, which of course is pretty neat. And finally for her M6, when Promeia consumes Trial by Cold to trigger an abloom, it procs a second special abloom with a fixed 200% damage multiplier. But aside from this, it also generates 5 corrosive chill and 100 decibels with a cooldown of 15 seconds. And finally, it allows her attribute anomaly and disorder damage to ignore 15% of the enemy's all attribute res. And with her Mindscapes out of the way, let's talk about her possible Wenjins. Promeia's signature gives 30% anomaly mastery with its main stat, and if the equipper is an ice agent and uses an EX special or special attack, their ice damage is increased by 20% for 40 seconds. This stacks up to 2 times for a 40% damage buff, and at 2 stacks, her abloom damage increases by 35%. This Wenjin's buffs also has a refreshable duration, so they are pretty much permanent on Promeia. Overall, it's a pretty big damage buff for her, while also enabling her to take more advantage of her core passives out of battle AM-based buffs. And it's one of the 2 anomaly Wenjins that actually give anomaly mastery out of battle. But on that note, for alternatives, the only other Wenjin that gives out of battle anomaly mastery is Arya's Ghost in the Shell. Plus, it also gives 90 AP just by equipping it, making it a great stat stick. But just note, Promeia cannot activate a majority of its passive. Now, Fusion Compiler is also great, especially if you happen to have refinements on it, since you can easily get its huge AP and attack buff due to her spamming EX specials to proc ablooms. However, it is very important to note that its pen ratio main stat does give diminishing returns for her abloom damage due to her passive's 40% abloom def ignore, which isn't really ideal when running her in lower end hyper carry comps without non-Gong Yu, where she triggers less disorders, so her damage becomes mainly abloom focused. However, for disorder and most of her team comps in general, the diminishing returns become less felt since disorders and shatters combined will make up a huge chunk of her damage, and those aren't affected by her def ignore. Plus, its huge AP and attack buff is way more than enough to make up for the diminishing returns, especially for those teams. As her 4-star options, it's the usual 2. Electro Lip Gloss is good for an AP, attack, and damage buff when enemies are afflicted with anomalies, which will be most of the time. And it is her best 4-star, but its only downside is that it's a paid BP Wenjin. While Weeping Gemini, as usual, is a great free-to-play option with its main stat and lots of AP just by inflicting anomalies. But with possible Wenjins out of the way, let's talk about drive discs. For the 4-piece set, she only really has one option, and that's the Notes from the Chain set, which is her best set. It grants a 48 AP buff for 30 seconds after triggering an abloom, and after triggering freeze, it grants her a 16% all attribute anomaly and disorder damage buff for 30 seconds. Plus, all of its effects also have a refreshable duration, so they're pretty much permanent. This is her signature set that was pretty much made for her, giving her tons of buffs just by playing her how you normally would. So it's a great general use set for any type of team, so it's really the only set you should consider using in most cases. Now for the 2-piece set, it's fairly simple. Her best option is Phaeton's Melody, since it gives AM to help get a bigger AP buff from her passive and a higher bigger abloom damage buff to her teammates. It's also worth to mention that she does get less AP from this compared to a Freedom Blues 2-piece, but the bonus abloom damage it enables her to get more than makes up for it. However, if you do have an extremely good Freedom Blues or Chaos Jazz 2-piece, you can use that too for way more AP, but only if it has way better substats than Phaeton's Melody. Granted, you are sacrificing a bit of her team-wide abloom buff. But with her possible drive discs out of the way, let's talk about stats. For main stats, you want AM on slot 6, Attack Pen or Ice for slot 5, and AP for slot 4. Now if you're wondering why even bother giving her Pen for slot 5 despite her abloom def ignore, well, it is true that Ice and Attack is better for buffing her abloom damage. However, like I said when talking about Fusion Compiler, for most of her teams, due to how fast she applies anomalies, a huge and considerable portion of her damage still comes from shatters and disorders, which don't get affected by her abloom def ignore. So pen ratio is still most definitely good, especially if it has way better substats and if you're running Fusion Compiler as well, since it makes up for the diminishing returns it gives her ablooms by buffing her other damage sources more effectively than attacker damage percent, since pen buffs are rare in her teams. However, with that being said, just don't run it if you have her M1 or are running her with other def reduction sources like Nicole, since that would make the diminishing returns from pen way too big. And don't use it as well for lower end or non-Gung-less hyper carry teams, since those comps put more focus on her abloom damage. But in cases outside of those, the damage difference between ice damage, pen ratio, and attack percent isn't too big, so just pick whichever one has the best substats. So on that note, for substats, just like any anomaly unit, you only really need to focus on AP and attack, then optionally a bit of flat attack and pen for good damage, since there is no anomaly mastery substats. While for minimum stat recommendation, I recommend around 300 to 400 AP and 2300 to 2600 attack depending on your Wenjin and substat luck. But honestly, since you're only going for AP and attack, just get as much of both as you can, with you of course prioritizing AP. And if you have the ability to do so, going for more than what's on screen is advised, since these are only minimum stat recommendations. With our stats out of the way, let's talk about possible teammates. Due to how Promeia is designed, she is a unit that prefers to be ran with abloom units who can also proc lots of disorders to maximize her corrosive shield building and to fully utilize her team-wide abloom buffs. She also takes up a lot of field time, so units that can allow for that are also preferred. But with that being said, one of her current best teams is an abloom-focused team with Vivian. However, she can also work with Arya, Grace, and Bernice, albeit there is a lot of caveats to consider when doing so. And as usual, just like for most Anomaly teams, the best support for this team is Yuzuha, but units like Zhao, Suna, and Astra can work as well. But it's worth to mention that Nicole works particularly well in this team because of her defense shred stacking really well with Promeia's team-wide abloom Defignore. From my experience, the best unit for this team is Vivian, since she can proc a lot of ablooms and help trigger lots of disorders for Promeia while still being relatively easy to play. However, she has a major issue wherein her ablooms can have a downtime problem since she can't regen them fast enough due to how fast Promeia can proc them with her EX specials. So if you have Yuzuha, I advise that you have her build anomalies for Vivian so you can give Vivian an ER slot 6 just so she can somewhat keep up with Promeia. Bernice is also usable, but she doesn't trigger as much ablooms compared to Vivian, so her damage still mostly leans towards disorders. And it's important to mention that the ablooms Promeia procs from burns will generally deal less damage due to burns inherently low damage and Promeia having the same abloom multipliers regardless of element. And just because of this fact alone, she is most definitely not better than Vivian, but merely an alternative if you don't have her. Now moving on, Arya can most definitely proc more ablooms than Vivian, with the Arya plus Promeia combo having the potential to deal lots of damage due to the sheer amount of ablooms you can trigger. Just make sure to have Arya be the one dealing damage during stuns, since she'll deal more damage than Promeia due to her stun-centric self-buffs. Now, I highly recommend running Suna instead of Yuzuha in this team to make this combo easier to play, since her fast fandom power generation enables Arya to deal consistent damage way easier. However, if you don't have Suna, I do not recommend running Arya with Promeia, since the team becomes way too clunky to play, especially outside of stuns, since Arya will end up clashing way too much with Promeia for field time. And finally, Grace is your budget option, and despite not dealing as much damage as the other three, she's pretty fun to play since she makes the team more quick swappy. Now, she also suffers from the same problems as Bernice, wherein Shock's inherently low damage causes Promeia's ablooms to deal way less damage. So this particular combo is really only for fun for the Grace fans who do want to try something different. Plus, it's pretty fun watching her nade spam deal lots of damage due to the combo of ablooms and disorders. But moving on, similar to Arya, you can also run Promeia in a more hyper carry setup with Yuzuha and Non-Gong Yu. And this particular combo is actually one of Promeia's best teams due to how much damage they enable her ablooms to deal. Now, if you don't have Yuzuha, Nicole, Astra, Suna, and even Sokaku can work, but if you don't have Non-Gong Yu, you can run Lycon or Trigger with her signature for her defense shred. And no, you won't have a problem with corrosive chill generation since her ablooms give 15 points back and her basics regen energy fast enough to allow you to spam her dodge EX special for even more points. However, the drop-off in performance does become very noticeable due to the lack of disorders, and unlike Non-Gong Yu, they can't proc ablooms. But despite this, the team should still be able to clear content. Now, as for other teams you can try, which aren't really her best teams, you can try to go for a mono ice disorder team with Miyabi and Yuzuha. And it's actually a pretty fun combo since Frostburn and Ice are still technically different elements, so they can trigger disorders off each other. And thanks to Promeia's fast anomaly building and Frostburn's anomaly buildup buff, you'll end up triggering a lot of disorders, ice anomalies, Miyabi charge attacks, and Promeia ablooms. And the neat thing is, you can use both of them together for Ice Week content. But aside from that, Miyabi doesn't really benefit much from Promeia and her ablooms. And they do end up clashing for field time, so the team needs extreme field time management and good knowledge of when to quick swap to be played at a serviceable level. And more often than not, it can feel very clunky to play, especially if you don't know what you're doing. So with that being said, it's definitely far from her best comp, and Promeia benefits way more from being in an abloom team. So it's a team that's more for fun than anything if you want to try something different, and it's not something that's really meta. On a similar vein, you can also try running her with Yanagi and Yuzuha for a pretty fun quick swap comp that triggers a lot of disorders to help proc Promeia's ablooms a tiny bit faster. Plus, Yanagi does buff the damage of the disorders that Promeia helps trigger, and she doesn't take up too much field time since you can offload her damage pretty fast. But sadly, just like Miyabi, she doesn't really benefit from the ablooms, and shock still results in less Promeia abloom damage. And Yuzuha is pretty important for the team, so you can drastically reduce the field time Yanagi needs to build anomalies and have an easier time maximizing disorders. However, the team could still function without Yuzuha, but it does become harder to play since it needs good field time management and quick swapping. But if you do know what you're doing, the team should still perform decently enough to clear content. And again, this is more of a fun comp to try and is most definitely not her best team. Now before we end, it's worth noting that Velina is gonna be a wind anomaly unit, so she might be another good teammate due to Promeia's synergy with Vortex. But since her kit hasn't been officially revealed yet, I'll refrain from talking too much about her. But that's about it. Personally, I'm probably gonna have to skip since I want our boy Billy and the 3.0 update is coming. I mean, come on, how could you not roll for our boy Billy? I've been waiting for his S-rank version since the game came out. But anyway, make sure to tell me what you think about her in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub.